Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode we bring you insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Presenting lambs clean to the abattoir becomes more challenging as the year progresses. We're joined in this episode by Michael Gottstein, Head of Sheep in Teagasc, to discuss this topic further. Michael highlights the key areas on the lamb that cause issues and how the industry has implemented changes to address this. We discuss the predisposing factors that will lead to lambs becoming dirtier and what practical steps can be taken at this time of year to reduce this. We discuss the role of remedial clipping, and Michael also highlights the need to ensure that transport vehicles are clean and suitable for the task. We finish up with Michael summarising the key areas producers are finishing lambs in the coming weeks and months can focus on to help keep their lambs clean. We start off, however, with Michael explaining the Clean Livestock Policy and its importance.
It's about basically having livestock clean when they're being sent for processing. So look at in Ireland we produce livestock for food, and when they arrive at an abattoir, they need to be processed and they need to be some way relatively clean and hygienic, so that the people who are involved in the processing of those livestock can do that without having any carcass contamination. So I suppose that's the background to it. It's about trying to minimise how much dirt, and in particular wet muck and feces that's on the particular areas of the fleece where a lot of the processing kind of takes place.
And Michael, that obviously has issues for food safety, but it also has issues for how long that product can last on shelf as well.
That's it. Yeah. So I mean, there's a food safety element to it, and we've all heard about things like salmonella and Campylobacter and E. coli in cattle, maybe, So look, those are rare. The people who are involved in food processing take a huge amount of steps to make sure that all the food is very safe and hygienic, but also look at bacteria. The more bacteria that are on the carcasses and the different cuts, the less the shelf life is. So there's big benefits, I suppose, for everybody. I suppose there's benefits for consumers, the cleaner things are, and I suppose there's a job there for everybody. Farmers are food producers, and there's a job for them to make sure that they play their part as well in presenting the animals in a hygienic fashion.
So before maybe we get into some of the issues of why it occurs, maybe just as a recap, Michael, where that issue occurs in lamb, like you mentioned, wet lambs are an issue. Maybe just take us through, like, as the cut lines are the big issue with dirty lambs.
Yeah, so look at, I suppose really we don't have a problem with it during the summertime, because generally lambs are clean and dry and the weather is good and the ground is hard and everything is outdoors. And then I suppose around this time of the year, when things start getting wet and a bit more mucky, and the days are shorter and sheep don't dry out as quickly, and get a lot more rain, that all basically compounds itself, and I suppose we have sheep that are easier, are more harder to keep clean, and the conditions are more difficult. As well as that, I suppose, if we bring them into housing, so then we have to deal with the bedding and the challenges around housing and ventilation and dampness in the shed and things like that. So those all have impact. So really, I suppose we start seeing this becoming an issue as we come into the autumn, winter, and then in early spring as well. And then I suppose as we go out into, animals go back out to grass, there's a lot less. The areas, I suppose, that we often very much focus on, people are very much focused on the back end, the tails of lambs, and look at, okay, absolutely they need to be somewhat clean, but really that's not the most important place. It's the underline of the animal, behind the front shoulders there, those kind of areas, because that's where the fleece can bend in and touch off the carcass in the processing when they're basically opening up the lamb and pulling the fleece off. You want to avoid a lot of soiled areas along those cut lines. So really from the neck down along the center line of the belly, and then around the anus and vulva in your lambs. Those are kind of the areas where the cuts would be happening. And you want to have those areas relatively, as clean as we possibly can, and ideally dry. Difficult this time of the year to have dry lambs, but certainly clean, as clean as we possibly can, and preferably dry as well.
So if we'll move on to the predisposing factors. Like, look, lambs have been finished off, some are housed, some have been finished outdoors. There's meal feeding going on. How can we mitigate some of the issues around clean livestock?
Yeah, so trying to keep things as clean as possible. Okay, so if we can prevent the lambs from getting dirty in the first place, that'd be the ideal scenario. That obviously not practical always, and not always possible. So the cleaner we can keep things, the better. So it's always degrees of, what steps can you take on your farm to keep things cleaner than they would if you didn't take that particular step. So first area that we'd be looking at in lambs are things like that affect, we'd say, scouring in lambs, dirtying them, so things like parasite control. What are we feeding them? If we're feeding, diets that are going to make them very, very loose, lots of salt going in there, maybe into rations, lots of water being consumed, things like that. Outside, if they're outside trucks, if we're feeding them trucks or feeders, how often are we moving those trucks and feeders? At this stage, time of the year, the weather we're having at the moment, Ciarán, you put out a feeder a couple of hundred times, after 2 days, it's going to look like something, that you see around the hippo pool in Dublin Zoo. We need to move them, otherwise they're going to get very, very soiled in those particular areas. So moving them, root crops, if we're putting lambs out onto root crops, or stubbles to finish. Obviously, there's a lot more soil surface there, so maybe looking at things like clipping the bellies of those lambs and crutching them around the tail as they're going out onto those crops, just to prevent the stuff, the mud and the dirt from sticking to them in the first place. If we're doing that, we need to do that a good few weeks before they're coming fit for slaughter, so that there is a little bit of regrowth there, in case we need remedial action prior to slaughter. So those are the things like, free access mineral buckets as well. Are not a good idea for lambs. They tend to make them a little bit more loose and scoury as well. So, avoid giving them free access mineral buckets.
You mentioned remedial action there, Michael, and clipping. Like, if lambs are out and they're after getting dirtier in the trucks and they may not be suitable for slaughter, what does that remedial action look like? How do we go about doing it?
Yeah, so if we have very dirty lambs, the lambs when they go to slaughter are categorized A, B, and C. And if they're A, they're fine. If they're B, there's some minor remedial action, and sometimes if they're C, they're rejected, or need to wait a period of time for some remedial action to happen. Generally, that's clipping. So they clip away the dirt. I suppose the challenge here is if you had very dirty lambs that were bare shorn, it'd be very hard to do that remedial action. So we generally would say they need about at least 4 weeks of regrowth between clipping and slaughter for you to have that regrowth if you needed to do some remedial clipping. Look, by and large, I think if lambs have very little wool, there's a lot less there for the muck and the dirt to stick to. And they generally will tend to be much cleaner, and they'll tend to dry out much quicker as well than full fleeced lambs. I suppose it's not possible now to bare shear lambs at this stage unless they're going into a house, because they're going to be too cold, for outdoor finishing systems. For indoor finishing systems, I suppose there is the option there of bare clipping them, putting them into a house. They'll have the benefit of the shelter, and then they'll obviously be less wool for stuff to get stuck to, and also they'll dry out a lot quicker because they won't have as much wool on them. Again, what we're trying to avoid, I suppose, in the first place is them coming in contact with lots of loose, sticky feces or muck or dirt that's going to basically stick to the skin or hair.
So, Michael, in some cases, hindsight is 20/20. If you have lambs that are fit and you have to draft them for slaughter, but they could potentially fall into category C, what can you do with them?
Yeah, so look, I suppose if we have dirty lambs, and they're going for slaughter, really it's important that we take some remedial action before they go on the lorry or go into the trailer. And really it's about clipping them and tidying them up, and having them as dry as you possibly can, if that's a possibility that they can be, if they're indoors, that we put them into a drier part of the house and put a bit of straw bedding under them or something, if they've been maybe on slats to dry them out. If they're outdoors, and there is an option there to bring them in, if they're on a diet that you can suitably bring them onto, then that's a positive. But for most people, it'll be doing some level of remedial clipping, and that's important because you don't really want. Even you could have a batch of clean lambs there, Ciarán, with a few very dirty lambs inside it, and in transport, those dirty lambs will destroy the clean lambs in the bunch if they're not they're not tidied up beforehand. So really, it's about shearing them. Shearing the long bits of dirt off them. Usually that's around the tail area. I wouldn't go shearing the belly of them really, because I think that will probably be done in the slaughter plant. Unless it's very long and there's an awful lot of stuff there. But it's important, I suppose, if you are going to clip them, that they don't get dirty after clipping, because if they get dirty after clipping and transport, then you're going to be in trouble at the slaughter plant, because they won't be able to do the remedial action.
And you just raised a final point is well worth covering. The transport itself, the trailers that are bringing these lambs to the factory, they also need to be clean and dry at this time of the year, because that could potentially bring a clean lamb to a dirty lamb by the time it reaches
absolutely
the slaughter plant.
Yeah, so absolutely. Look at obviously it depends on how long they're traveling. So the shorter the distance, the lower the risk. The longer the distance, the higher the risk. Having some sort of absorbent material on the floor of the trailer to prevent splashes. If there's decks, preventing the kind of soiling from the upper decks coming down on top of the lambs and the lower decks. Those things are kind of important. Try and keep them, clean and dry. Look, not always easy to keep them dry in the trailer. I mean, we need ventilation in the trailers. If it's raining, there will some water come in through. I think wet clean is not a problem. Wet dirty is a very big problem. And having the lambs wet makes it's much easier for a wet lamb to become a category C lamb. A dirty lamb, we'd say, that would, if it was dry, maybe be a category B lamb, could very quickly become a category C lamb if it becomes wet. And so those are the things just for people to keep an eye out. Look, I think, Ciarán, to be honest with you, producers and the industry have embraced this. We haven't seen many problems with it, I suppose. In the last year or so, there was initial teething problems with it while people were getting used to it. And I think by and large, most people are making a big effort in terms of presenting lambs clean. And I think the hauliers as well have really, know their game at this stage, and they'll see lambs coming in, and we hear occasionally of a haulier saying to farmers, look, we can't take those lambs, they're not going to get through, you need to do something with them, So I think by and large people are becoming really much in tune with it. I suppose the couple of messages we want people to take on board is, trying to prevent the lambs from getting dirty in the first place is the easiest, if that can be done. So the couple of things really that we want to look at there is clipping. If they're going into very dirty situations, such as kind of root crops, forage crops on stubbles, those type of things, parasite control and the general health control things, proper nutrition to avoid them from being too loose and scoury, avoiding acidosis, things like that. Moving trucks if they're outside, so that they're not becoming contaminated with mud and feces around the feeders. Obviously trying to feed them out on drier areas on the farm, drier patches. When we're housing them, then adequate floor space, adequate bedding. If we're on straw bedded accommodation, if we're on slats, again, same story, keep an eye on the slats that they don't get clogged up and dirty. Water trucks indoors, that they're not leaking, increasing the humidity in the shed, ventilation in the shed, open up the vents that they are in to keep it dry. And look at if they are being bedded with straw, give them plenty of straw to keep them clean and dry. And the other thing, I suppose, is just important for lambs that are going indoors on all concentrate diets. They really should have, in all cases, access to some long forage. So whether that's a bit of silage, a bit of hay, or a bit of straw, access for something to chew on and to help them to ruminate. In addition to the ad lib concentrates that they'll be getting to get them over the line in terms of finishing.
Michael, plenty of things to consider there. Great having you on again.
No matter. Thank you, Ciarán.
We're going to wrap the episode up at this point. I have included links in the description of this episode to the Clean Livestock Policy for Transport document and the Clean Livestock Policy document itself, a guide for producers, in the description. They can be used as a useful reference for anyone who wants to find out a bit more information about it or go back over some of the aspects that Michael has discussed. That's it for me for this episode. Again, for any updates from our sheep program, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and listen in to any of our episodes.